Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Nun Tet. We're going to continue with the discussion that we had yesterday, and then we're going to move on to another sugya, which then from there we'll get off on a tangent on a third sugya. So what we had yesterday, when we started our chapter, is this idea of this machlokes between Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Yehuda about can you slaughter on top of the altar, kodshe, the entire altar, or only half? At first glance, Rav Asi quoted Rabbi Yochanan. At first, he said, "Listen, Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Yosi held the mizbeach was entirely in the north." Then he said that must be the basis of this machloket in our Mishnah, and that's why he thinks you can use the entire altar because the whole altar was situated in the north. Versus Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think so. Then Rabbi Zeira questioned this and basically proved that's not connected. Then Rabbi Zeira said, "I'm going to go search and find though." Where did Rabbi Yochanan get this? That Rabbi Yosi said that the Mizbeach is in the north without it appearing in any Mishnah. So what did he do? He took a Mishnah in Tamid, the Mishnah that talked about where the Marach HaShniya was placed, and the fact that it was on the southwest side, but 4 cubits toward the north, and not much further in, right, which it should have been, and therefore proving, and based on Rabbi Yosi himself, who makes this whole thing about trying to get to the closest place when you get out of the Mizbeach HaChitzon. By the way, some people asked, and I was thinking about it myself, I think I have an answer to it. In general, you don't jump up there, right? You're still not in the closest place. You still have to walk around the south side and come up the ramp. But if you think about it, when you come up the ramp, right, what you want to do is when you get up the top of that ramp, you're on the southwest side, basically, and you want to be in the first closest space that, again, has both things going for it. Number one, it's as close as possible to where you are at that point. Number two, you want it to be opposite the entrance exit to the Heichal or possibly also the Ulam. And that makes perfect sense if it's all the way in the north. If it's half or if it's completely in the south, then it's not going to work. And that's what we said, except we ended with saying, and therefore it must be, okay, now what he said is, never said it's Rabbi Yosi in that Mishnah, but what he's saying is it must be, this is where we see a position that it's in the north, and therefore we assume that position must be Rabbi Yosi. So the first question we had was, you know what? You could get to those same numbers if you do half-half. And then that was all because 4 and 6 are really one and the same, because one includes the Yesod and the Amah, as it right the Yesod and the Sovev, which are 2 Amot, and then adds right. Then there's 4 in addition to that, or which would be 6 if you include those. So basically, that was a possible rejection. Now we're going to have a second rejection by saying, well, maybe you're right that the Mizbeach is completely in the north according to this Mishnah. But who's to say this is Rabbi Yosi's position? Perhaps what Rav Shravia is going to say is, this is Rabbi Yosi the Galilean's position. And now we're going to have more pictures because now we're going to have another opinion here. And the opinion is Rabbi Yosi the Galilean. And we're going to see from a different source, a different braita, that Rabbi Yosi the Galilean explicitly, now he never says the Mizbeach is in the north, but from where he places the basin in the temple, we're going to be able to prove that he also holds the Mizbeach is in the north. And then, or also, we don't know what Rabbi Yosi held. What we have is, I just want to, so you're not confused. There's Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, both of them appeared on Mishna. Now there's Rabbi Yosi the Galilean, 3 different Rabbi Yosis. And what he's going to claim is, let's read it inside, Hamani, Rabbi Yosi the Galilean. You're right that the Mishnah in Tamid was talking about the Mizbeach was completely in the north. I'll accept that. Not like Rav Brava, who tried to claim not. But even accepting that, who's to say it's Rabbi Yosi's position? Maybe it's Rabbi Yosi the Galilean's position. Now, I'm going to prove to you right now that Rabbi Yosi the Galilean definitely holds the Mizbeach is in the north. In which case, it's not clear that Mishnah we quoted is really Rabbi Yosi's position. And then that's the second difficulty on Rabbi Zeira's trying to bring this Mishnah and say, oh, look, this is clearly Rabbi Yosi, and because the Mizbeach has to be in the north. Number one, maybe the Mizbeach doesn't have to be in the north according to this completely. And number two, maybe this is someone else's position entirely. So let's go into Rabbi Yosi the Galilean's position. So we're at the very bottom of Nun Chenem a bit. Ditanya. Rabbi Yosi the Galilean Omer. Mitoch shene'emar v'natata et kiyur ben ol moed. Now you have to really read the rest of this pasuk. Okay, Shemot chapter 40, verse 7. Place the kiyur, the basin, bein ol moed u bein hamizbeach. It has to be between ol moed, which is basically the heichal or the ulam, right, the hallway outside the heichal, and the altar. Okay, so it has to be somewhere in between there. Okay, so now what else do we know though? There's 2 conflicting things really. Then it says ve'et mizbach ha'olah, Okay, you have to read the rest of this pasuk. Ve'et mizbach ha'olah, this is in the same chapter, but verse 29. Sam petach ol moed. Where does the mizbach ha'olah go? Right opposite the entrance of ol moed. Okay, why is this important? Well, you're going to see right now. Because what do we have here? We want to leave the Heichal and have no barrier in between the exit of the Heichal and the altar. And we also, though, want to have the kiyur in between the Heichal, the sanctuary, and the Mizbeach. So on the one hand, we want to have it in between. Okay, you don't necessarily have to look at the picture yet. In a second, I'll explain. On the one hand, you want to have it in between. On the other hand, you can't be in between because if it's in between, the first thing you see when you walk out of the Heichal has to be the Mizbeach. That says, Ed Mizbeach HaOlah, Sam Petach Ol Moed. Put it right at the exit of Ol Moed, meaning walk out of the sanctuary and you, boom, you're in the Mizbeach. So, where does the kiyur go? So, Mizbeach bepetach Ol Moed, v'lo kiyur bepetach Ol Moed. So that's what they learned from that pasuk, right? That's the second issue. So on the one hand, it says v'natata kiyur ben ol moed uben hamizbeach, but on the other hand, you can't put it there because the mizbeach has to be the first thing you see and not the kiyur. So hechan hayanot no. So according to Rabbi Yosi the Galilean, because this braita started off with him, where would you put the kiyur then? Okay, bein ulam lemizbeach mashuch kim'a klapei hadarom. So wherever the mizbeach is, okay, in this picture it happens to be on the south side because that's the first option we're going to talk about. Now, there's two kiyurim here, but it's the first one on the left. Basically, we're going to go diagonally outside the altar. In other words, between the altar and the ulam, that hallway that leads to the sanctuary. We're going to move a little south of the mizbeach. So it's still opposite the ulam, but it's not exactly opposite the mizbeach. It's diagonally opposite the mizbeach. It can't be, according to Rabbi Yosi the Galilean, and this is going to be the key thing, it can't be physically between the mizbeach and the ulam, okay? Because otherwise it'll be blocking the exit of the heichal. Now you can see from the picture that this doesn't really work, and that's why there's an arrow moving the kiyur over to the right more, over to the north. Why? Well, my kasavar. So what does he hold? Now we're going to go through the three positions we've seen. Is it completely in the north? Is it half in the north, half in the south? Or is it completely in the south? Okay, so south, half, or north. So we're going to go in that order. South, half, north. Why are we going to go in that order? Because in the end, we're going to prove that Rabbi Yosi the Galilean, the only way to explain his position must be that the Mizbeach was completely in the north. So what we have to do that is to reject all other possibilities. So if you say the whole thing is in the south, I'll make it a little smaller so you can see the whole thing here. Okay, the whole thing is in the south. So now you have the Heichal, right? You walk out of the Heichal. Okay, now, if the Mizbeach is 32 cubits, so if the whole thing is in the south, how many cubits of the exit of the Heichal are in the south? 5, because remember, 10 cubit opening, 5 in the south, 5 in the north, because it's right in the centered in the room. So if you say that Kulim Mizbeach b'darom kai, we have a lot of options here. Go to the wall of the Heichal. Go over from those 5 cubits, okay? Basically, the 5 cubits of the Mizbeach, you can't put the kiyur there. The first 5 cubits that are on the, on this, obviously we're in the south, but on the northern part. But you have 27 more cubits that are free here. All these 27 cubits, right? And let's say, put it a little bit over, right? Move it a little bit over to the next 5 cubits over. In other words, put the kiyur in between, right? So basically, right next to the wall of the Heichal, where the wall of the Heichal starts, meaning you're done with the entrance area, those 5 cubits, put it right there. Could be right there. Why not? And then what's the beauty of this? Well, the beauty of putting it right there is it still opens to the ulam, because really it has to be between, right, the Ol Moed. Now the ulam is also close enough to Ol Moed, and you're basically between the wall of the Heichal and the Mizbeach. You have the kiyur there. It's perfect, right? As opposed to moving it all the way to the side where it's not in between the Mizbeach and the ulam. It's off to the side. Idami kasavar, picture number 2, we're still saying it's in the south. Let's say you hold, and we know this from yesterday, Kedushat Heichal v'ulam chadehi. The sanctity of the ulam and the Heichal is the same, which means it can't even be opposite the exit of the ulam. So how much of the exit of the ulam is on the south side? remember the whole exit or entrance is 20 cubits. So when you leave the ulam, 10 cubits of that is on the south and opposite the altar. So don't put it there, but put it just south of there. So instead of the mizbeach being on the side, right off to the side, not actually opposite the altar, we have a perfect thing. Now it's between the wall of the ulam and the mizbeach, and that would be perfect. So the fact that Rabbi Yosi the Galilean doesn't put it there proves he obviously doesn't hold that the mizbeach was completely in the south, because if it was in the south, it would have had a better place. Because remember, we're just trying to come up with the best possible scenario between these two issues. Number one, we want it between the mizbeach and the ulam and heichal. Number two, it can't block the entrance or exit from the sanctuary to the mizbeach. Okay, next option. Inami kasavar. Also, if you say chetzio b'tzafon v'chetzio b'darom, it's half-half. Then what's your issue? Well, nukme mikota lechalu l'darom bein ulam lemizbeach. Again, if it's half-half, so now how much of the mizbeach is on the south side? 16 cubits, half of it. It's 32, 16. Of those 16, only 5 of them are problematic because it's the 5 exiting the heichal. So don't put it in those 5, but put it right next to those 5. You still have 11 cubits of space where you can have the kiyur, and it's smack in the middle of the heichal and the ulam. And we know where this is going, hopefully, right? Which is inami kasavar kedushat ulam veheichal chadahui, right? And as we said, what if you say, I keep saying this, the kedusha of the heichal and the ulam is the same, in which case you're going to have 6 cubits still left, because you just move it over 5 from the 11, right? Now you have basically 10 cubits are blocked of the 16, and you're still left with 6. So nukma mikotel ulam ulidarom ben ulam lemizbeach. Put it by the wall of the ulam. And do you understand why they're saying the wall and not the entrance? So now it's going to be in between the wall of the ulam, which starts after the entrance, and between that and the mizbeach. And you can put the kiyur right there, and then again you have it perfectly in between the mizbeach and the ulam without blocking the entrance. So that would be perfect. But obviously, the fact that he doesn't put it there and he moves it over, right? Remember, it's off to the south on a diagonal from the altar, not opposite the altar. Elalav mishum de kasaval kule mizbeach b'tzafon. And here's your perfect picture, although we're going to question it a little bit more still. Why is this your perfect picture? Because the mizbeach is completely in the north, okay? And now we realize that the only place to put it is on a diagonal in the south, because otherwise it's right. Nothing of the mizbeach is in the south. Now there's a weird assumption here, which we're going to have to deal with. Why can't you put it in the north? All right, you could put it on the north on the other side, opposite, right? That doesn't block the exit. Okay, so we'll get back there in a minute. But right now they say the mizbeach is completely in the north, and there's nowhere else to put the kiyur, so we're going to put it in the south on a diagonal, right? And it's not going to be opposite the altar. It will be opposite the exit of the heichal, but it's not blocking, so that's fine because the mizbeach is not on the south side at all. The downside is it's not exactly opposite the mizbeach, but there's no choice. So now we're going to figure out why is there no choice. What do you mean? Kinami mukmat lemikotel heichalu litzafon. You keep saying it's on the south side, but why not put it on the north side? Why don't we move it to be, okay, now when it was completely in the south, obviously we wanted the south. When it was half-half, it doesn't really matter. South, north, we're going to have the same problem. But if it's completely in the north, so we can actually put the kiyur on the north side, to the north of the exit of the heichal. So right? So mukmale mikotel heichalu litzafon. So basically now we're just doing the reverse we did on the other side, which is walk out of the heichal. Those 5 cubits we're going to leave free, but put it on the other side of that. Put it to the north of that. And then it's opposite the exit of the ulam, which is fine, right? Unless we go and say the ulam is the same as that, but we're going to get there in a minute. But assuming we are just concerned with the exit of the sanctuary, so just move the kiyur over to the north. That's a possibility. And then you're much better off, because now it's going to be in between the ulam and the mizbeach, and it's not blocking the exit. But, right? Or, havale ben ulam and the mizbeach, let me go to the phone. Right, and then it would be bein ulam lemizbeach, or v'nukma mikotel ulam ulitzafon bebein ulam lemizbeach. Now here they don't even bother to say if you say the kedusha of the ulam and the heichal is one, because we know that already, Or at least, if you're worried about the exit of the ulam, at least put the kiyur to the north of that. And again, if the entire mizbech is on the north side, you still have 22 cubits of space to play with. So that doesn't make any sense. To which they say, no, it does. Why can't it be in the north? And why was it so obvious to them if we go back 3 pictures that the kiyur is going to be on the south side? And we didn't even suggest at first it was going to be on the north because Amar Krat Safona. What does it say? It says, V'shachat oto, where do you slaughter kachim kachim? Al yerech hamizbeach safona. Now, it could have said al yerech hamizbeach but safon. Why does it say the word safona in that phraseology, that way of phrasing it? Because she hates safon panui mikelim. They want the tzafon to be empty of vessels. They don't want to, as we say, shtup extra things in the north side. Why not? The north needs to be free for, okay, if we talked about a pull between 2 directions, on the one hand, you want to walk out of the Heichal and go straight to the Mizbeach. On the other hand, you also want the kiyur between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. But now we have a third thing pulling, right? So those two were a little bit contradicting. Now we have a third thing pulling, which is we don't want vessels on the northern side because we need to leave the space open for slaughtering. And it's a drasha on the word safona. So if that's the case, basically that explains why we put it a little bit off to the south. So this was all to explain how from Rabbi Yosi the Galilean's opinion, which in the end we saw was a very strange opinion, that the kiyur is going to end up on this diagonal off to the south from the altar, and it's not going to be in its ideal location between the Mizbeach and the Ulam. The only way to explain that is because the Mizbeach is completely in the north, and we can't put it on the north side because the north side has to be free from vessels. Okay? That's the end of our diagrams for today. So now there's one last thing in this sugya to finish up, which is Man Tana de Palagale to Rabbi Yosi the Galilean. Who disagrees with Rabbi Yosi the Galilean and doesn't think the Mizbeach is completely in the north? Now, let me just remind you. We said the Mizbeach is completely in the north. That's either Rabbi Yosi, that's what Rabbi Yochanan said. But we couldn't prove that in the end, because now we just said the Mishna that we thought was Rabbi Yosi maybe is Rabbi Yosi the Galilean. We have Rabbi Yosi the Galilean who also, definitely says that. And then we have Rabbi Yehuda, who we ended with yesterday, who says it's half-half. Now we're going to see the third position, who says it's in the south. And that's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. He says it's in the south. I want you to remember him because when we get to Midot, you're going to see he features prominently. Midot is a Masechet completely about the Midot, the measurements of the temple, where everything is. Okay, it's where those maps that we talked about yesterday are going to come incredibly handy. And he has a lot to say about the temple, which is interesting in and of itself because remember, they're living post-temple time period and none of them really saw the temple. So, or some of them will see, like some people feature prominently and say, oh, I saw it. They were still from then. Anyway, he has a lot to say about the temple. Anyway, Ditanya, he says, Ditanya Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Omer Tzafona, she hates Safon panoi miklum, va'afilu mina mizbeach. If the Safon is supposed to be empty to have space for slaughtering, which is why Rabbi Yosi the Galilean, who has the Mizbeach there, said the kiyur, though, can't be there. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov comes and says, the Mizbeach can't be there either. Can't put the Mizbeach in the north because you need the space in the north for slaughtering the Kodesh Kodashim. If you stick the Mizbeach in there, it took a lot of space, right? The whole room, I just want you to understand the midot. We said it was 135 in width. And if you're going to put a 32 by 32 cubits all in the north, right? Half of the north is 67.5. I'm sorry. If you half the room, right? Half the width, which is the width of the north, okay, is 67.5. So if you put 32 cubit space and you have to slaughter on the side of that, again, depending on where you think north is, but you're limiting almost half of that space that you have for slaughtering is limited because it's got an altar there. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, of course you can't put the Mizbeach there, right? You're worried about a small kiyur, small basin. Mizbeach for sure can't go there, and he puts it in the south. Now I want to just mention for one quick minute the picture yesterday, because on the map we saw that the Mizbeach was on the south mostly and a little into the north, which is not any one of these opinions. So why did the map put it there? So that we'll see when we get to Midot, but there's some opinion in the Achronim, or maybe in the Rishonim, I forget. But there's an opinion there about how to understand something that claims that that's where the Mizbeach was. Okay, so even though here it seems like there's three positions, there's really this fourth position, which is mostly in the south, but a little into the north. And that doesn't, it's not said explicitly, but it does come out of something there. And we'll get there when we get there in Midot. And that's where the picture goes, which is fascinating that, that becomes the mainstream opinion, at least according to what they decide to put on the map. Anyway, we're going to move on. Amar Rav, second sugya for today. Mizbeach shenifkam. In a minute, we're going to see why we're here, what this has to do with anything. If the Mizbeach, according to Rav, we're going to see Machlok at Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Here's where the study guide begins on this section. Maybe I'll share screen a little bit. If the Mizbeach gets ruined, okay, something's wrong with it, gets broken, a part of it, any kodshim shenishchitu sham, any kodshim that were slaughtered there, okay, slaughtered at the time that the Mizbeach was damaged, psulim, they're disqualified. So basically what we're saying is when you slaughter it, even though slaughtering doesn't happen on the altar, or it doesn't necessarily happen on the altar, we learned that it could, and that's going to be the connection in a minute. But if the Mizbeach is damaged, you can't, your korban is disqualified if you slaughtered it while it was damaged. When Rav gave us this halacha, he said, I had a pasuk, but I can't remember. Kislik Rav Kahana. When Rav Kahana went up to Israel, Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yosi. He heard Rabbi Shimon Rabbi, who said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yosi, how do you know exactly this halacha that Rav said? The mizbeach that's damaged, anything offered that was slaughtered while that happened, is disqualified. Now we know this why this is here. That's where we got that you can slaughter things on top of the altar. But now we're going to understand this pasuk a little differently. Now, this I guess theoretically could be understood in two ways, but we're going to go with the basic explanation, the way people explain it, which is, it sounds like if you take this pasuk literally, here's the mizbeach hadamata seli, and use it for slaughtering, meaning this is the only place you can slaughter. Now, what? The mizbeach is definitely not the only place you can slaughter. It says al yerech mizbeach tzafona, next to the altar you slaughter. So it doesn't really make sense. So what do we do with this pasuk, right? What? Just on the altar you slaughter? Of course not. Ela, what it means is zavachta alav, on it, meaning when it's complete, you can slaughter things. Okay? Ela kashu shalem velo kashu chaser. You can only slaughter things when the mizbeach has to be intact and not damaged when you slaughter. That's what we do with that pasuk. Okay? So that's the connection between the pasuk and the mizbeach and the slaughtering in that pasuk. So when he heard this, when Rav Kahana got there and he heard this and he remembered that Rav had said, I had a pasuk and I couldn't remember, Amar, Rav. This must be the pasuk that Rav forgot. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, also this and also this are psulim. What on earth is the also this and also this? So Rashi helps because we were talking about one thing. What did we say? If the mizbeach is disqualified when you slaughter, it's a problem. So what does it mean when you slaughter? He said also when you slaughter, also not. When you slaughter, meaning, okay, Rashi says, ben shenishchetu, it's more toward the bottom of the daf, bishat pkimato, ben shenishchetu achar tikuno. Whether you slaughter it when it's damaged, that's what Rav said, or whether you slaughter it once it's fixed. Okay, well, if it's fixed, what's the problem? Well, what it means, what Rabbi Yochanan is really saying is, it doesn't go by the time of the slaughter. It goes by, is the mizbeach damaged from the time you designated the animal for a korban. So if I designate my animal for the korban and the mizbeach is damaged, and then it gets fixed and then I slaughter it, it's a problem. According to Rav, it's not a problem because when I slaughtered it, it wasn't damaged. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's a problem because when I designated it, it was actually then, now what's the problem in this whole thing? I'll just say it straight, the Gemara is going to say in a minute. It's dachui. What does it mean, dachui? At that moment, when I designate the animal, or according to Rav, when I slaughter the animal, or Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, when I slaughter it, Rabbi Yochanan also, when I designate it, there's a time where I can't bring it on the altar, which means it's rejected from being on the altar, right? We learned already that once something gets rejected from being a korban, even if the situation is rectified later, we don't want dichuyim, we don't want things that are rejects. Right? Like you don't want something that was rejected and then bring it as an offering to God. So since the animal, let's go with Rav, was slaughtered at a time when it was rejected from going on the altar, so it was rejected. it's a problem. You can't use it. According to Rabbi Yochanan, even once you sanctify the animal and said, I'm going to use this as my korban, and if during that time period the mizbeach becomes damaged, you can't do anything, okay? You can't fix it. So now they say, b'mai pligi, what's really at the root of their machloket? Rav savar ba'alei chayim einam nidchim, v'Rabbi Yochanan savar ba'alei chayim nidchim. Rav says live animals aren't considered rejected, meaning only once you slaughter them does the whole issue of rejecting, the animal being rejected, come into play. When they're still alive, yes, it's sanctified, but it's not like ready for sacrificing right now. It hasn't, you haven't started the process, it's alive. A live animal isn't considered a reject, okay? So if there's a problem and it goes away, we can bring it. But once it's slaughtered, that's when the clock starts ticking to say, oh, is this rejected? So if when you slaughtered it, it couldn't be brought, then it's a problem. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Ba'alei chayim nidchim, even when they're alive, they can be considered rejects, and then we can't bring them on the altar. Now we're going to focus on Rav. We're going to have two difficulties on Rav, one from a braita, and the second from Rav's own words. From the resolution of that, we're going to mention some opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and from there we're going to dive right into this machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi, which is going to bring us into tomorrow's daf about a whole different thing, okay, which is really all about the size of the altar in the time of Moshe. Okay, so we're going to get there. It's a total tangent from our sugya. So now we're going to bring these two difficulties against Rav. Now I'm going to start sharing my screen and you'll see why, because we're going to bring a braita, and I want you to see it visually. It'll help you. We're going to bring a braita right now. Oh, that's not what I wanted to share. 1 second. Okay, sorry. I'm going to bring a braita, and I'm going to go to here. I'm going to switch. Okay, study guide. So now here's our machloket, mizbeach shenifgam. Okay, so it's damaged mizbeach. Rav says if nishchitu, it's a problem. And Rabbi Yochanan said even if nikdishu, right, if it was sanctified. And the machloket is ba'alei chayim or not nidchim, or they are nidchim when they're alive. And then we have the source for Rav, v'zavachta olotecha v'echlamecha, right? So it must be you slaughter when the altar is complete and not when it's not. Now we get to, which by the way is also the source for Rabbi Yochanan. He just says it even earlier, right? It kicks in even earlier. We don't really see a source for that. Now, if you see in this source, we're going to quote a braita. Okay, what I did here is I crossed out all the versions that are correction. We're going to change it 3 times. Okay, now we're going to change it once, then a second time. We're on our 3rd reading. That's going to be the difficulty against Rav. And then we're going to answer by making a 4th change to it. Okay, so what I did here is I underlined all the words that really get changed along the way. So that can also help you follow. So here's our braita. So again, we're not going to have a difficulty until we get to the 3rd reading. Kol hakodeshim shayu ad shelo nivneh mizbeach v'achar kach nivneh mizbeach psulim. Any kodshim, right, animals that existed before the mizbeach was built, meaning I designated the animal, but the mizbeach wasn't built yet. Okay, so let's say I'm living in between the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, and I designate an animal, like let's say I designated it likely when the first temple was still around, and the mizbeach hasn't been built yet, and then the mizbeach is built, it's psulim. Why? Because it couldn't be used before, and therefore it's pasul. To which the Gemara says, nivneh, what are you talking about? Dichuyimi karaninu, right? We must be taught, what they're assuming is we're talking about. They assume, let's say I'm living, let's give a better example. I'm living 2 years. They assume we're talking, I took an animal a year before maybe I knew the temple was being built. So I designate an animal and I say, I'm going to bring this when the temple is built. So I can't do that. Why? Because, right? Now, what's the issue? Well, the Mizbeach wasn't, right? Like Rav said, the Mizbeach has to be intact and the Mizbeach wasn't built. But the Gemara says, forget that. This is way worse than the other. This is dichuya mi'ikaran in him. Now, we talked about things being rejected. This is something that was never able to go on the altar in the first place. That's called dachuya mi'ikara from the start. Now, why is that a problem? Well, there's a big machloket about this of Amoraim, whether dachuya mi'ikara, what does rejection mean? Is rejection is worse when you could have done it and then you get rejected, as opposed to never even making it in the first place. If you could never do it in the first place, some people say that's not dachui. Okay, so this, if you were living in, just before the rebuilding of the temple in 516, and you're living in 520 and BCE, and you designate an animal, okay, but it was never ra'oi in the first place. So we don't call that dachui, or at least not everyone does. And the assumption is that if that were the case, so this is where it gets a little tricky, but so what if it's machloket amoraim? Well, in that debate, no one ever brought this braita to prove one side or the other, so it must not be that this is the right braita. Therefore, they changed the wording. Ela ad shelo neherasa mizbeach. We must be talking, you're still in first temple time period before the temple's destroyed. Then the temple's destroyed, and then what happens? So if you had these animals designated before it was destroyed, so it was way to go on the altar, then Nivna Mizbeach 70 years later, right? It's psulim. So they say, Neheras ha'izkun lehu. If the Mizbeach was destroyed, right? If the temple was destroyed, well, by the time 70 years went past, that animal's going to be super old and not probably dead by then, right? Animals don't live that long. And even so, it would be too old to go on the altar. Remember, there's all these age limitations. So that for sure can't be. So third reading, and this is going to be the difficulty on Rav. It wasn't damaged yet. Psulin. Here you have exactly Rabbi Yochanan's position, and that's why it's difficulty on Rav. If there were kodashim that you sanctified the animals, because they're called kodashim, they were sanctified, but they weren't slaughtered yet, and then they were there, you had them, and then the mizbeach was destroyed, damaged, and then you fixed it, right? So if that was the case, it wasn't problematic before it became problematic, it's disqualified. Because anytime after designation, if it's disqualified, it's a problem. And not from slaughtering it. To which the Gemara says, here's our answer. And here they like to do this a lot. If you already corrected a braita and said there were mistakes in the braita and we had to change the words, so the Gemara says in a rhetorical question, didn't you already raise difficulties on this and already change up the words on it? So so change the words a little more and change it to the following to match Rav. If you slaughtered it and the mizbeach wasn't damaged and then it got damaged before you did the blood, it's disqualified. Because again, from the time of slaughter, if it's rejected, it's a problem. And that matches Rav. And once you change the wording, then it doesn't match. It's not a problem at all. And that's an interesting theory that once you already made corrections and edited things, obviously there were problems with the transmission of that braita. So it doesn't bother us to do more of that. Okay, now we get to the next question. Rav Gidol Amar Rav. Now here it's from what Rav himself said. Okay, Rav Gidol said in the name of Rav, Mizbeach shene'ekal. If the mizbeach is uprooted from its spot, we're talking about the inner altar. Maktirim k'toret bimkomo. You can just burn the incense in where the mizbeach used to be. Now, what more damage is there than the mizbeach is just not there? That's the worst kind of damage. It's just not existing. So what do you see here? According to Rav, you can actually burn incense even though the mizbeach isn't there. To which the Gemara answers, and this is going to get us into this big machloka Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi, Keda'amar Rava, like Rava said, Modeh hayat Rabbi Yehuda b'damim, hachanami modeh Rav b'damim. We need to go back a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda would say that if the mizbeach was not there, okay, or the mizbeach, let's say there wasn't enough room on the mizbeach, you could basically what we're going to see in a minute is they sanctified the floor of the azara, and you can actually, we saw this opinion before, you can actually offer things up on a fire anywhere on the floor of the azara, anywhere you want. But that was for a fire for burning the imurim. But he agrees that you can't pour the blood on the floor. Okay, you can't say, oh, there's no altar, let's pour the blood on the floor. He only allows the imurim, the burning of the parts, but not using the floor for the blood. So likewise, we'll make the same distinction for Rav. The mizbeach that's uprooted, you can put the ketoret and burn it on the floor, but modeh Rav b'damim, he won't allow the blood to be poured, which is why if you slaughter it and it's pagum, it's damaged, you can't do anything because we're talking about doing the blood. So that fits, and we've resolved the difficulties against Rav. Now we want to get to Rabbi Yehuda, and the Gemara says, my Rabbi Yehuda. Where's this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and who does he disagree with? So we're going to have a long machloket between them. Today we're going to get to 4 parts of this machloket. One is how to understand a pasuk about the story of when Shlomo built the temple. Okay, a pasuk from Sefer Melachim. Then we're going to have a machloket about what size the altar that Moshe built was, what was the height of the altar that Moshe built, and what was the height of the courtyard, the curtains around the courtyard that basically, closed in the area where the altar was. Okay, so there are going to be 4 different debates between them, and they're all going to be interconnected, you'll see. My Rabbi Yehuda did Tanya. Bayomahu kidash hamelech tocha chatzer. So on that day, here we get it. Shlomo sanctified the chatzer, which is the azara, basically. He sanctified the whole azara for the purposes of burning sacrifices. Okay, asher lifnei beit Hashem. Ki aseh shem et ha'olav et mincha et chavei hashlamim, because he did all these sacrifices. Ki mizbach hanechoshet asher lifnei Hashem katon me'achil et ha'olav et mincha et chavei hashlamim. Because the mizbech hanechoshet that was there was too small. Okay, by the way, there's going to be a whole shiur on Gefet today about the Mizbech HaNechoshet. Okay, there's a lot of shiurim that I didn't mention. There's another article by Shuli that went up yesterday about altars. Okay, we're talking a lot about the altars. And there was also a shiur of Yafi Clymer, who's back from Machshava Shniya, about who built the Beit HaMikdash. So there's a lot of shiurim up that I haven't mentioned in the last few days, but you can look on Beyond the Daf on the site. Okay, so now we have this pasuk. So it says the Mizbech was too small, and therefore he sanctified the floor. Comes Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, Dvarim kichtavan. This is understood literally. Okay, there was not enough room for the sacrifices. So Rabbi Yehuda said, what did they do? So they basically sanctified the floor, and then you can sacrifice on the floor, and that was that whole opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And there you have it. We could have stopped here. But we have a whole interesting debate between them. Amar lo Rabbi Yosi, turning out on a bit, Rabbi Yosi says to him, Halo kfar ne'emal, what do you mean? The Mizbech was definitely not too small. Why? Okay, before we get here, you just have to understand. The Mizbech that Moshe did was 5 by 5 cubits, okay? Although we're going to have a debate about it. But until we get to the debate, we're going to assume, according to the Torah, it says 5 cubits wide, 5 cubits long. 1 cubit on each side, which basically means 2 of the cubits on the side where it's 5, right, are going to be taken up by the kranot. Then there's the amah where the kohanim walk. So that's an amah by each keren. That takes up another 2 amot. So we're left with a 1 by 1 square to sacrifice korbanot. Okay, we're going to do a little math here, but it's pretty simple math. So now, before the Beit HaMikdash was built, it said about Shlomo, Elef olot yaleh Shlomo al mizbechahu. He did 1,000 olot a day on a 1 by 1 space. Okay, now, ilu bebeit olamim, you get to the temple, okay, and on the day he sanctified the temple, we're going to see how many sacrifices he brought. So let's just do the math first. If a 1 by 1 space, you can sacrifice 1,000. That's why it's going to be very easy math. The temple in the time of Shlomo was 20 by 20, which gets you a 400 square cubit space. So we're going to be able to do 400 times the amount. So 400 times 1,000 is 400,000. So now, if before the temple was built, he could do 1,000 a day on a 1 by 1 space, then in the time of the temple, when he has a 400 cubit space, he can do, right, cubit squared space, he can do 400,000 sacrifices. And there's enough space for that. So Rabbi Yosi is going to say, wait a minute, he did a lot less than that. So how could you say he didn't have enough space? That the Mizbech and the Choshet didn't have enough space? Of course the Mizbech he built had enough space. So ilu bebeit olamim wherever Yizbach Shlomo et Zevachim asher Zevach Lashem. Bakar 22,000 bakar. And the rest of the pasuk says, and another 120,000 sown. So basically you have 142,000 and not 400,000. So for sure he had enough. And if you start calculating, the Mizbeach of Moshe actually had a bigger capacity. So you can't say he didn't have enough capacity. In other words, what it's saying is that this had a huge capacity. Forget that. He didn't say Moshe was bigger. The Mizbeach now he has is way bigger and can do a much larger capacity. And therefore he didn't need to sanctify the floor of the altar because it was the floor of the Azarah because it wasn't enough space. So what does it mean? Elamau katan mehachil. Ka'adam homer lechavero ploni nanasu pasul avoda. What's the Mizbach HaNechoshet? It's not the one that Shlomo just built. It's the one that Moshe had. The one of Moshe was too small, so he basically, okay, it's like someone says, you're a real midget, okay, and in a derogatory way, which is not a nice way to talk to anybody, but if someone were to say that, that's basically what he was saying about the Mizbech of Moshe. And this is basically pasul avodah. Like this pales in comparison to the big one, and therefore we're not going to allow it to be used anymore. And that's what the pasuk means. So they differ on this pasuk. I just want to point out one thing. Rabbi Yehuda took this pasuk literally. Rabbi Yosi says you can't possibly take it literally. It makes no sense. What's interesting about that is in the next 2 machlokot, we're going to zigzag back about who takes these pasukim literally. The next pasuk we're going to use, it's going to be Rabbi Yosi who takes it literally, and then we're going to go back to the next part of that same pasuk where it's going to be Rabbi Yehuda who takes it literally, which is just, I think, interesting because this Dvarim Kichtavan is going to come up a bunch. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shapir. So now the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir Kama Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi has a good point. If really it was 5 by 5 cubits in the time of Moshe, and we did that all math, and then we got to the fact that this Mizbeach was huge and could do much greater capacity. So really, Rabbi Yehuda makes no sense. So Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei damar Mizbeach shasa Moshe gadol haya. He holds the Mizbeach of Moshe was not 5 by 5. Okay. Even though the pasuk says chamesh amot orech v'chamesh amot rochav, so we're going to have to explain how could he possibly say that it wasn't 5 by 5 when it says explicitly in the Torah. So let's see. Ditanya. Chamesh amot orech, chamesh amot rochav, dvarim kichtavan. Okay, that's understood literally. Okay, by who though? By different Rabbi Yosi. He's the one this time who says this is literal. Rabbi Yosi Omer ne'amar kan ravua. Okay, this is in the same pasuk. It says, it says, no, it's not that pasuk. Sorry, it's a different pasuk. Amar kov amar rochbo. Oh no, sorry. Let me just read it. It does say it in that pasuk. Asita de mizbeach hatzei shitim. I want you to see the whole pasuk because we're going to dash in different parts. Chamesh amot orech, chamesh amot rochav. Ravua yeh mizbeach. Okay, it should be square. V'shalosh amot komato, and 3 cubits in height. Okay, so now we're going to have a machloket about what's this word ravua coming for, and we're going to have a machloket about how to understand the 3 cubits. So, but first we're on the 5. So it says ravua here, and it says by Yechezkel ravua. Ma lahalan, in a minute we'll see the pasuk. Me'emtza'ito haya moded. Gang afka me'emtza'ito haya moded. When it says ravua by Yechezkel, it means from the middle we're measuring. Okay, we're going to see in a minute how he gets that. The radius. So here also we're measuring 5 from the middle, which means it's like 4 squares of 5 by 5, which are all together, right? Because you're going to go 5 in each direction, and you're going to end up with a 10 by 10. And once you get to 10 by 10, Moshe's have much greater capacity than the Mizbeach in the time of Shlomo. In other words, again, relatively speaking. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yehuda's position. Now, Hataminalam, where do you get it from there? Dichtiv, in Yechezkel it says, V'ha'ariel shtemesrei ama. Okay, the Ariel is the Mizbeach, or perhaps even just the Maracha, okay, where they would burn the things. Anyway, it says, Shtemesrei ama l'chol ruach. Okay, so they say, when it says it's Shtemesrei ama, the braita says it's l'chol ruach, meaning 12 in every direction, meaning the radius and not each side. Oh, eno el shtemesrei al shtemesrei, right? So again, if you say 12 is from the middle, then you get to 24 by 24. If you say 12 is on each side, it's 12 by 12. So which one is it? Well, Kashu Omer, in that pasuk it says El Arba'at Riva'av. Each fourth, each quarter of it. So because they say for each 4 quarters, then it sounds like it's 12 by 12 in each 4 quarters, and that gets you to 24 by 24. Melamed sheme'emtza hu moded. So what do you see here? There it's me'emtza. The Gzeira Shava gets you that also here it's from the emtza, and 5 by 5 is not really 5 by 5, it's 10 by 10. So that's that we got to, and that explained why Rabbi Yehuda disagreed with Rabbi Yosi in the previous. Now we're going to say Rabbi Yosi, ki gamar Gzeira Shava. Now he must do something with that word ravua. What does he do with it? He actually has a Gzeira Shava to a different situation, to a different pasuk. Bigov hohu digamir. He learns it for the height. Titania v'shalosh amot komato dvarim kichtavam divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now while Rabbi Yehuda doesn't take 5 by 5 amot literally, he takes the height of 3 amot, which is in the same pasuk. He takes that literally. But Rabbi Yosi doesn't take that one literally. Rabbi Yosi Omer, ne'amar kan ravua, v'ne'amar lahalan ravua. Ravua also appears in the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the inner altar. Now, what are the midot of the Mizbeach HaPnimi? It's 1 by 1 with a height of 2 cubits. So now he says, what do we see about the Mizbeach HaPnimi? Ma lahalan govho pishnayim ke'orko. The height is double the length. Afkan pishnayim ke'orko. So when it says ravua, what it means is the height is double the length. Okay? Now the length is 5, according to Rabbi Yosi, so the height is 10. This is going to lead us to another machloket. Marlo Rabbi Yehuda, how can you possibly say the height of the Mizbeach was 10 and not 3? Because halok kvar ne'amal ve'et hachatzer mea ama v'koma chamesh amot. It says the courtyard was 5 amot high. Now, what's the problem? If the Mizbeach is 10 and the courtyard, the curtains around the area where the altar is 5. That's not very appropriate. We don't want the Kohen standing on the altar and doing the Mizbeach and everyone can see him, right? If he's at a height of 10 and the walls go to 5, everyone can see him doing we don't want that. We want things to be private in the Mishkan. So Amar lo Rabbi Yosi, what are you talking about? The Chatzir wasn't 5, it was 15. Okay? Now we have a problem because it says it was 5. So we'll get to there in a minute. And with this, we finish for today, but there's still more to do tomorrow. Et kal'eh chatzir v'masach shara chatzir asher al mishkan, the kla'im were the curtains around the chatzir. Asher al mishkan v'al mizbeach. So the first thing he says is, look here, it says it's the mishkan and the mizbeach. Ma mishkan eser amot, af mizbeach eser amot. Here's a further proof for him. The mishkan's height was 10, the outer wall, and the mizbeach was 10. So what do you see here? That the mizbeach itself was 10. That just supports his previous. And ve'omer kla'im 15 amal hakatef. There's another pasuk which says the kla'im were 15. Okay, so now we have a problem because the pasukim seem to contradict. One says 15, one says 5. So he says, I go with the 15. We'll just finish the next line. Umat Talmud lomar 5 amot. So what do we do with the 5? Misfat mizbeach ulamala. Okay, now we have something strange. We said a minute ago the Mishkan was 10, and therefore the Mizbeach was 10. But what he means here by the Mishkan being 10, he means the Mishkan was at least 10. In other words, when it says Asher al Mishkan v'al Mizbeach, if the Mizbeach is 10, then the Mishkan must be at least 10. But then he brings a pasuk that says, but it was actually 15. Now, why did it say 5 before? Because they wanted to say from the top of the Mizbeach, which was 10, there were 5 more. When it said Koma Chamesh Amot, what it meant is the Chatzir went 5 above the 10 of the Mizbeach. Okay, so we have, again, it's a little bit weird because there's one that says 5, one that says 10, one that says 15. The 10 is really just, it's at least 10. The 5 is, it's above the 10 height of the Mizbeach. And there you get to that it was 15. And we're going to do more of this tomorrow. So what we did today was 3 things. We started with the Mizbeach. We started with the opinion that maybe Rabbi Yosi the Galilean is the one who said it in the north and not Rabbi Yosi like Rabbi Yochanan claimed or like Rabbi Zeira tried to prove anyway from that Mishna. You can't prove it because maybe that Mishnah is Rabbi Yosi and that all had to do with the placement of the kiyur in the temple. Then we got to this machlok at Rav and Shmuel about what stage of the Mizbeach being damaged is going to ruin a korban. Are live animals considered dachoy and disqualified or only dead animals once they're slaughtered? And then we had source for Rav and 2 difficulties against Rav, which we resolved, one from a braita, one from Rav himself. Then through that, we mentioned in the resolution to the last one, we mentioned this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So now we want to go in depth into Rabbi Yehuda. And they have 4 machlokot. One about, was the Mizbeach really too small or not? And therefore, when he sanctified the floor, was it to allow for more Mizbachot? Or was he really just disqualifying the Mizbeach Hanachoshet of Moshe? Then we had, what was the size of the Mizbeach that Moshe? Was it 5 by 5 or 10 by 10? What was the height? Was it 3 or was it 10? And what was the height of the courtyard? Was it 5 or 15? And those are just 4 machlokot that Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Yehuda have that all, one depends on the other. And we got to one from the other. And that's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day.